everyone, and welcome to our session, The Business of Government, Creating Real Efficiencies That Last. Hi, I'm Emily Jarvis, and I'm the Senior Manager for Events here at GovLoop. And today I have the added pleasure of also being your moderator, so thanks so much for joining me. And a special thank you to our sponsors, Una, Snowflake, and Rimini Street for helping us put on this session today. So let's get right to it, because as agencies look for ways to modernize effectively, many leaders are rethinking how work gets done. Instead of simply stretching existing resources, the focus is shifting towards smarter processes, better tools, and approaches that free teams to spend more time on mission-driven work. So the real question becomes, where can we unlock meaningful efficiencies that genuinely improve outcomes and not just kind of redistribute the workload? So today our experts will share how they're rethinking operations, technology investments, and service workflows to reduce friction and free up capacity. But before we get to that, we do have some housekeeping items to go over. First things first, we do have some great resources available for you on the console under that resources button. So make sure you check that out. That's also where you can learn a little bit more about their speakers and their titles. If you need access to that closed captioning feature, just look for that show captions icon at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Of course, we hope you don't have any technical difficulties, but if you do, send us a message through that Q&A tab, and one of my GovLoop colleagues will get you all sorted out. And you can use that same tab to submit questions to our speakers, and we want your questions, so put them in early and often. You can also chat with your fellow Govies using that chat button in the bottom panel. Finally, we are recording this training, so check your inboxes tomorrow because we'll email you a link so you can watch the entire session on demand. All right, with all of that housekeeping out of the way, we've got a big pile of speakers headed your way, so let me introduce you to them. First up, we have Christine Mai Sakuda, who is the Chief Information Officer for the state of Hawaii. We have Evan Rowe, who's the Deputy Commissioner for Workforce Services and Transformation within the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. We have Ryan Alcorn, who's the Principal AI Strategist at Una Solutions. Adam Roth, who's the Vice President for Partnerships and Government Relations at Una Solutions. Robert Freeman, who's a Rimini Fellow for Oracle Technology. And last but certainly not least, we have Adam Edelman, who is a Senior Manager for Solutions Engineering at Snowflake. Thank you all so much for being here. And to better get to know each of our speakers and their perspectives on operational transformation, we sat down with one-on-one interviews with our speakers. Here are those conversations. Here to talk about all things digital services is Christine Sakuda, who is the Chief Information Officer for the State of Hawaii's Office of Enterprise Technology Services. Christine, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Emily. Aloha.
I love that. All right, so here's the deal. Digital services, this is a vast conversation. So before we get into lessons learned and challenges and opportunities, can you lay the groundwork for me? Paint a little bit of a picture of maybe some ways that your organization has worked to modernize or change some of your digital services and why it's mattered.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Emily. We have a lot going on in the Office of Enterprise Technology Services. One of the key initiatives that we have done recently is that we have implemented a single sign-on feature for government services, digital services online. And previous to that, we have 18 departments within the executive branch of state government in Hawaii, and they all have many applications. And so citizens would have to log on to each application separately. So we developed a single sign-on tool called My Hawaii. And now when a citizen wants to log in to different applications, they use the same sign-on, which is a multi-factor authentication sign-on. And this is the first step, first critical step in Hawaii's journey to develop a citizen ID. And so many of the departments, over 100 applications, critical applications of state government, are now use the single sign-on feature called My Hawaii, and we're looking to get the larger, more complicated systems on in the near future. So that's one of the things that we're doing. We also have other initiatives to move to implement our cloud first strategy to move all of our legacy systems that are on, hardware systems in different data centers and different offices across the state into the cloud, and many other modernization initiatives going on.
That's awesome. And that single entry portal, I know as an end user would be so beneficial. I'm not going to name the state where I am, but we're not quite there yet, but
Yeah.
I would really appreciate moving in that direction. All right. So, when it comes to challenges, there are quite a few that are going to pop up. But once you've moved really from that planning phase of things to actually building, developing, deploying, whatever tense you kind of want to go there, what are the first big hurdles that you encounter, or maybe something that surprised you in the journey?
I think the state of Hawaii has a hybrid IT infrastructure environment, ecosystem. Some of the services are decentralized. The departments, services, Health and Human Services, Department of Health, Unemployment Insurance, they really manage their own applications. And we provide at the Office of Enterprise Technology Services enterprise-wide governance, enterprise-wide security strategies. We track the different systems and we try to find common links across them. And so that framework, that hybrid structure is important to understand because we can't really, our ability to influence and implement our strategies is significantly based on the health of the partnerships that we have with the different agencies that we work with. And so partnerships is very important to ETS. And it can be some of the challenges where some of the challenges are, or where some of the opportunities are, because we don't like to really implement strategies with a hammer and force people, make people do things, departments do things. We find that's not as productive as working with them, and that takes a lot of work. And so those are identified as some of the challenges early on in a lot of our big enterprise initiatives that we really try to head off by reaching out with the departments, collaborating with them, getting their buy-in from the very beginning on our enterprise strategies.
Wonderful. Okay. So digging into, let's say, some of the hard parts that you were just kind of mentioning, you've got everything that you're dealing with from procurement to the legacy systems. You've got the big elephant in the room, which is always culture and how folks are adapting to these technologies. What barriers have you seen end up being kind of the hardest ones, maybe the stickiest ones to overcome?
Mhm. Well, I don't think those are technology barriers, that we're very familiar with. They're very human barriers, or not barriers, but challenges. And we have a workforce that is very diverse in Hawaii. Some of the workforce are new, they come in, they're fresh. The younger workforce are very digital, they're digital natives, and they come in and they have a very different mindset and way to solve challenges than other people that have been in state government for 20, 30, 40 years. And they're experts in their own right, but they have a different mindset, having really spent decades within the state system and the state bureaucracy. So the key challenge, because state employees are most critical asset, is it's around organizational change management, or how do we understand the dynamics around big initiatives, big modernization initiatives, replacing legacy systems with new systems that fundamentally change the way state workers do business. And we have a couple of those initiatives going on right now. So much of the success is dependent upon the employees joining, hopping onto the journey together, that we're all in the same canoe, kind of paddling together towards a destination. And that takes a lot of work. And through several failed modernization initiatives within the state, we have realized, along with our partner departments, that investing in people, understanding people's insecurities about the change that's coming with the new tool is really the biggest investment that we can make at the start of big modernization projects. And that can slow the project down. And it can cost a lot of money up front, that are not tangible, like buying, purchasing software, and purchasing hardware. And so that's really paying off with some of our big modernization initiatives in the state.
Wonderful. All right, I only have two more quick questions for you. And the first is, so far we've talked about some of the barriers that get in the way, some of the tough parts. What what's really ended up working well for you all? What's been your secret sauce, whether that's a process change, a partnership, something small, or something big that's kind of had a trackable difference in getting things into production? Where have you seen that?
Well, I'll springboard off of what I had said earlier around organizational change management, that at the end of the day, the success of the modernization projects really depends on people. And there are a lot of dynamics around that. In Hawaii, we have 20 to 25% vacancy rate. It depends on the department, so we have a hard time finding talent that we need for a wide variety of reasons. And so we really want to leverage the talent that we have within state government. And many of those people have been in state government for a long time. And yet, when we try to implement different components of an enterprise resource planning system, like our enterprise financial management system, we're in an RFP phase right now. The eligibility systems with MedQuest, with BESD, SNAP and TANF benefits, the unemployment insurance modernization, all of those initiatives are in the process of being modernized now. And they will fundamentally change the way the state delivers services to our community. And so I think from lessons learned, from hard lessons learned, we have really invested in where we have found success is spending time upfront to communicate to the state workforce, why is a modernization so important? What is the impact on you? It is going to be tough. It is going to be hard. And to also make commitments to maybe do some staff augmentation as well. Think outside of the box. That really reflects, we understand that you can't always do more with less. How do we supplement your expertise that we need on the modernization project with, filling in the gaps on the day-to-day operational work? And so that's, while the modernization projects are not done yet, they're still in various stages of implementation. It's really paying off because the biggest asset within state government are the people. They're the ones that are using the system. And so we're really excited about that. We're all in, from the leadership all the way on down. Embedded in all of that is process change and leveraging the AI to help us streamline processes. How do we be more efficient and more effective? And that is very disruptive in the projects for the staff that have been doing the services with older systems. So with the amount of modernization work that we have in Hawaii, with the recognition that organizational change management, investing in people are fundamental, with the advent of AI applied onto the tools that will fundamentally change processes. We're really excited. It's a big change initiatives happening within the state.
That is so cool. All right, final question for you, and you can take it in either direction. So, looking back, is there anything you would do differently? And or if you could give one piece of advice to an agency who's looking at Hawaii's example, What piece of advice would you give for them to modernize?
Well, I'm a big advocate of governance, and as I mentioned, we're in the Office of Enterprise Technology Services, and we need, before we start any major initiative, it's really important to make sure that the leadership across the departments, across multi-agency departments are on board. And that takes a lot of work. And it's not just the leadership and the directors and deputies, but it's their ASOs, their administrative service officers, all the way on down to the IT staff, because at the end of the day, these are not technology projects, they're business transformation projects. And so getting the buy-in from the stakeholders at the top all the way on down before we start our journey or as we start our journey is really critical for its success.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Christine. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you too, Emily. Thanks for having me.
Here to talk about all things transformation is Evan Rowe, who's the Deputy Commissioner for Workforce Services and Transformation within Minnesota's Department of Employment and Economic Development. Evan, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Emily. Really excited for the conversation.
Yeah, so let's talk about day to day because I think sometimes when we're talking about these large scale changes or modernization efforts, everyone looks big picture. But as employees, we're all thinking about, well, how does this impact my day to day? So when you're thinking about the day to day realities of government work, where do you see some of the biggest opportunities for simple tools or maybe policies to remove some of the friction that eats up people's time?
Well, I think it's a great question, and in my experience at least, the friction that matters the most isn't the glamorous stuff, right? It's a lot of that repetitive kind of low judgment work that just tends to eat hours out of every single week that you have, right? It's the collecting updates, it's routing approvals, it's reformatting information for the fifth stakeholder. Like if a person is acting like a router, right, like carrying a file from one place to another, there's probably a tool or a process that can do it better, right? And I really appreciate that you made the point about it's not just tools, it's processes sometimes, right? Like when you can have the best technology stack in the world, but if you're trying to replicate a paper folder based process that maybe made sense in the 1980s, you're also not going to succeed. So it's got to be a link between technology and business process. I like to think about it actually as a triangle of people, process, and technology, right? And if you're not thinking about all three vertices of that triangle, you probably won't be as successful as you could be, right? So I think a lot of this is just the basic stuff of our day-to-day work can be made a lot better through thoughtful applications of tools and policies.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I know for me personally, and now we're making this a therapy session for me, but one of the things that can be difficult for me, and I think a lot of government employees, is that everyone says, well, there's a tool that can just fix that. And I'm like, yes, but the time it's going to take to investigate that tool, figure out how to use it, get trained up on it, I might as well just do it the way I've been doing it. Maybe it's a touch slower, but like, this is a big investment. So how do you decide which toys, not tools, which tools are really worth exploring and investing in? Because you can't invest in all of them. So how do you know which ones are useful and which ones are just noise?
Yeah, well, at least a couple filters that I try to employ, right? Like, so first, the first question you got to ask yourself, does this actually solve a problem that I really have, or is this a problem that a vendor wants me to have, right? Like, I don't like so much of gov tech marketing and tech marketing overall is solutions that are looking for problems, right? You should just ignore solutions that are looking for problems. I think another just interesting question you can ask is, can I try it in an afternoon? Right? Like if if evaluating a tool requires like a 6 month pilot and a whole bunch of meetings and a steer co and all those kinds of things, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it does mean that it tells you how much work and how much change management is going to be required if you are trying to drive mass adoption of such a tool, or if you want to, or if you're going to have it scale in any way. Again, it doesn't make it bad. It just means like the level of effort actually does matter a lot here. I guess I think the other thing to think about is like there's new and then there's useful, right? And those two things are, it's like the Venn diagram is not like it's not two, but it also doesn't perfectly coincide, right? Like just as an example, like many of the generative AI tools that are out now, like are genuinely new and they're genuinely useful. They drive productivity and it's something that you didn't have access to before. But a lot of like what is branded as AI right now, it's neither, right? It's not new. It's like machine learning stuff that we've had access to for many years, or data analysis or things like that. And it's often not very useful. So like, it's not like, so novelty for the sake of novelty is not an asset inherently. The question is like, does the solution make your work better? If so, well, yeah, then you should be interested. But you also got to be thinking about that level of effort that's required to adopt, because you're not operating in a vacuum. And change management is a real thing and it takes effort.
All right. I think it's my connection that's unstable, Evan, which makes sense because I am also unstable. So that resonates, but it seems to be back now. And
Mhm.
that was such a lovely and perfect answer, but I missed the majority of it. So
Oh,
I'm going
okay.
to have you do that question again. Just kind
Okay.
of the way you answered it, for what I could hear, was
Okay.
perfect. You
Oh,
just went in and out enough that I think it's going to be difficult. And
sure.
I've moved things around in here, so hopefully we'll have a little
Okay.
bit better.
I was gonna say, yeah, and let me know if you need to move around more substantively, and that's okay
No,
too.
no, I appreciate it. I think we're good. But if
Okay.
you want to go back to
Yeah.
that, um, an example of, something that could really be
Or
powerful
did
for folks.
Well, did I guess okay, do you so should we so do you want to do the but do that question again though, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
please.
okay, sure.
Yes, please.
Okay. So like so in terms of deciding in terms of deciding what's actually worth exploring, right? So I think there's two questions you can start off with. Right? The first question is, does this solve a problem that I actually have, or is this a problem that a vendor wants me to have? Right? There's so much in gov tech marketing in general, right? It's solutions that are looking for problems, right? And that's just not a good use of time. Right? You should be. We have scarce time, we have scarce resources, we have scarce attention. We should be spending our time focusing on the things that actually are problems. The second question is, can I try it in an afternoon? Right? Like if a tool, or evaluating a tool, is going to take like a 6 month pilot and dozens of vendor meetings and the steering committee and all this stuff, that's not bad inherently, right? Maybe it's solving a really serious problem, but that's like a big bet that you're going to need to make. If you can try something in an afternoon, though, that suggests that you might be able to scale it, that it's a incremental change that can, that if you stack enough incremental changes together, you can start to make real progress. So think about that scale. And I think, and there's a third thing that I also try to think about, which is what's new versus what's useful, right? Those two things are not in perfect overlap. The Venn diagram is not as aligned to those things as you might think, right? Like as an example, generative AI, genuinely new, genuinely useful. Well, much of it, right? Like it's something that it's something that literally didn't exist, like, in its current capacity, 12, 24 months ago. And it's genuinely useful if you use it the right way, right? But like by contrast, a lot of like every company is now saying that they are an AI company, but including apparently Allbirds. But like you know, a lot of what is being branded as AI is neither, right? Like it's it's either like stuff that's existed for a long time, like data, data analytics, or like um, like machine learning, things that have existed literally for decades and is being gussied up in a new package, right? It's not about whether it's new, right? Like at the end of the day, the test is whether it makes your work better and it solves a problem that you actually have. That's what matters, and that's what I try to stay focused on.
So, with that in mind, and I think that's a really useful perspective because can I do this in an afternoon? It's less scary to try and take
Yeah.
on that level of commitment to a tool or a programming. So on that kind of same vein of small bets, have you seen maybe with your own work or with your team any examples of small changes, whether that's digital or not, that have had big impacts? Because I think of things that you don't think are gonna be a big deal, and then all of a sudden they are. Any in those in that category for you?
I've got like just like a really simple dumb one, right? And I'm not going to pretend that this is like a giant transformational change, but it is something genuinely that has saved me time, a lot of time, and members of my team a lot of time. So at our agency, we have like a weekly snippets process where I get from my direct reports, just what's happened in the last week, what's coming up in the next week, what do folks need, that kind of thing. And historically, right, like you get it over email, and everybody's formatting would be a little bit different, and so like and I think it's personally important as a manager to review these things yourself and have that pulse on the team. So again, it was just kind of this messy, unstructured process that I'd then collate and all those kinds of things. So like I one day I was going through this. I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. So like I went ahead and I built a Microsoft form, and I built a Power Automate flow that just like that automatically every week at 12 p.m. on a Tuesday sends an email to my team and links to the submission form, and then it just works, right? So like I think it took me about 45 minutes to do, and I'm not a developer, right? I'm not a technical person, but with these tools, in our case, the state of Minnesota has M360 Microsoft
Mhm.
365 licenses and access to Power Automate. Like all these tools were there, right? And I've been able now to share that same template and tool set with my colleagues who now again can benefit from like more structured information, more structured data, simpler submission process, and automating away some of that friction, right? And again, it's not really about like the form, right? I think the bigger point is like if I can build this, anybody on my team can build something like this, right? And then if one person can, if one person builds this, then your mental model starts to change, right? You can stop thinking about like, oh man, I wish somebody would do something about this, to like to start thinking like, oh hey, I can fix this, right? And
Yeah.
what excites me about that, right, is then if you can get enough people shifting their mindsets about this, then you're taking your teams from being passive consumers of technology to active problem solvers with technology, right? And that's way more powerful than any one software license you buy. That's turning yourself into a problem solver enabled by new approaches and new tools.
Yeah. We have a 3-year-old at home. And as anyone who's had a 3-year-old knows, they love to solve their own problems, most of which they create themselves. And my personality is I am a fixer. I want to come in and I want to fix the problem. And my dad actually set me down once and he was like, "You need to back up and let him solve his own problems or he's not going to solve them." And I was like, "Yeah, but it's going to take so much longer." And he was like, "But it won't in the long run because he will figure out how to solve some of these problems." And as you're talking about it, it has me thinking, oftentimes I will go to a technologist and say, "This is the problem I'm solving," and they'll whip something up. But it's like, well, if I could figure it out myself, we could also save that person's time to do something much more important, and I will have learned a new skill set along the way. So I do think that's such a valuable um, piece of advice because the barrier to entry on these tools is so much less than
Well,
what you need it to be.
and again, like, I talked a little bit about generative AI, and again, that is already transforming so much of our economy, our workforces, all these pieces. But I actually think low code, no code tools are another really powerful source of, of capacity expansion for our teams. It's not for everybody, right? Like, but I think those who engage with it can find similar meaningful opportunities to make their work better, which is really exciting. It's democratizing.
Yeah, it is. All right, two more quick questions for you. And the first is, and I absolutely hate this phrase, but there's this phrase of doing more with less, right? You have
Mhm.
less time, less resources. In a lot of cases in government agencies, there's less workforce than there was in the past. But the mission outcomes haven't changed. And for many state and local entities, they've actually grown as the federal portfolio has shifted a little bit. So government employees are stretched thin. You're doing the job of two or three people. What kinds of tools, and I'm not looking for specific names here unless you want to share, but what kinds of tools do you see that really help people perhaps not do more with less, but maybe do a little bit more with a little bit less?
Well, I'd start again with serious exploration of generative AI tools, right? I think, I personally use these, daily and it's a huge productivity enhancement for me, right? Like it can help you literally do things that used to eat up hours of time, right? Like it can help with research or first passes of documents or preparing for meetings, thinking through decisions, right? Like it's not a panacea, right? Like it doesn't replace judgment, and it only really and it really only helps if you know what good looks like. It's a force multiplier. It's not a substitute, right? But it's a huge, it is an incredibly powerful tool set if used properly to extend one's own managerial capabilities. I think this is going to be one of the biggest productivity shifts that, again, we see in employment, generally speaking. Um, those who figure out how to use it responsibly are going to be able to extend their own capacity. And I think agencies that see more adoption are going to be able to deliver better services as a result, which is really what this is all about, right? Like we are here to do work, which is to deliver great public services for the people that we serve. So I think it's a really key lever. I think another piece is thinking about organization, right? And tools that reduce I don't know, the tax of being organized, right? I mean, it can be something as simple as like shared docs over, like your OneDrives and those kinds of things. But that's a cultural item as well, right? In a lot of cases. And I think already most public sector entities have largely shifted towards that. But I think there are increasingly interesting things sometimes embedded into the daily tools that you use, again, that can free up time so that you can spend your valuable time on the stuff that really adds the most value. Meeting note takers in your video conferences, things like that. The things that reduce the, oh gosh, I wish I could remember what we said 2 weeks ago, so that you
Uh-huh.
have better memory, right? Like we have limited capacity. How do you expand that capacity so that you are again able to focus it in the places where like human thinking and human judgment really add that value?
Wonderful. All right. Final question for you. Once you've got a new tool at your disposal, how do you know if it's working? And I think you were alluding to this here a little bit just a second ago, but I think oftentimes we bring in new solutions and we say, "All right, this is the new way that things are operating. Go forth and use it." How do you actually track or know if a new workflow or the employee experience is actually improving with these new tools?
Well, I think there's a few signals you can look for, right? Like, and let's assume that this is not a mandatory tool, right? Like, if it's a mandatory tool, people are going to have to use it because they have to use it. But if it's an optional tool, like the first thing is, are they using it without being told to, right? Like, if you have to keep reminding people to do something, if you have no interest, if you're getting serious concerns from folks, that's a sign that, again, like maybe it doesn't mean it's not working, but it's a signal that you should maybe be double checking to make sure you're on the right path, right? I think also a lot about workarounds, right? Like oftentimes if you've got like a bad tool set or a bad business process, it's the official side of things is actually overshadowed by like the shadow side of things where it's I know technically we use this tool, but actually everybody, you're using this spreadsheet or this doc or or having the meeting after the meeting kind of thing. If a new tool or process is working, then you don't need those kinds of workarounds, right? So I think if you still are having those kinds of challenges, maybe you haven't fully solved the problem. The third the third one, and this is going to sound obvious, but I think you know, it is perhaps surprising that it doesn't happen as often as we would like, is talk to people who are using the tool, ask them, right? Like, don't, you can do a survey if you want, but I honestly think a conversation is better, right? Like, and if the thing that you um, tried to address as a pain point 6 months ago is not coming up as a pain point anymore, you're doing something right. And it's really got to come down, to the value that folks are getting out of a tool, right? Like it's not about usage, right? Because again, if it's a mandatory tool or something like that, usage is only a proxy for the actual outcome that you're seeking, right? So, try to quantify, right? Time saved, errors reduced. How do staff feel about their work as a result of that? Those are the real metrics that you want to focus on, and can give you a better sense, and give you the data that you need to know, did I get this right? Or do we still need to work on this a bit more?
Makes sense. Thanks so much, Evan. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Emily.
One area of government services that has seen major changes to their business operations is in the world of grants. And for many state and local governments that rely on grants to fund essential programs, securing and administrating grants has become increasingly complex, and modernizing grants administration wasn't easy to begin with. So, to understand what can be done, my colleague Lauren Walker sat down with UNA's Adam Roth and Ryan Alcorn. Lauren asked them why grant management modernization is critical to the business of government. Here's that conversation.
Grants structurally make up a significant portion of state and local government funding today. So historically, it's been 30 to 50% of operating budgets have been paid for by federal grant dollars. So it's a significant percentage of the spend that each local government, each state government relies on to provide the core services that citizens depend on every day. And so it's really critical that the funding is able to maintain itself. Otherwise, the states, local governments have to cut services, find new ways to deliver programs. At the same time, there's been an increase in pressure, and this is actually an historical increase in pressure for probably about 20 years. There's been this general path of moving towards increasing accountability, tracking performance, structurally different funding streams. And recently, there's been a shift in a dynamic where more federal funds are coming in as block grants, adding a different additional functionality requirements for state, local governments to not only distribute money, but also plan for how that money is to be spent, set up programs and services, and then track those performance. We see lots of areas of growth in federal funding, and Ryan can talk a little bit more about that on the funding side. But there's also a lot of more pressure on the accountability side in terms of how you're trying to manage these funds moving forward.
Is there anything else that's shaping the grants landscape for state and local governments?
So there's new executive orders that are coming out from the White House. These orders follow, though, a pattern. So if you go back to 2014, there was the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, which was the original sort of act that started to track about all federal spending and how that needs to be transparent to the citizenry, which demanded greater data management relative to federal spending, including federal grants. That moved into the GREAT Act, which was in 2018, which really focused on funding 2018, 2019, which really focused on funding relative to grants and put into some core standards. This is overlaid at the same time by an increase through the Uniform Grant Guidance and the 2 CFR 200, which really tracks and maintains the compliance standards and audit standards around federal funds. And so there's been heightened tension and pressure put into grant management because of these different structures. All of this, relatively speaking, can actually lead to easier reporting, more efficient management, as long as you have the right systems and structures in place. And things like the Federal Oversight Executive Order that just came out in August. If you sort of ignore the political rhetoric in it, which is important, but every president comes in with their own political agenda and political perspective. If you get to the heart of what really is in there, it's really focused on tracking and better accountability, better performance management, better grant management. But that really goes back to an historical trend all the way back to 2014 when Obama was in office, really showing a pathway of increasing demands on recipients of federal spending to have better reporting, better transparency, better data.
In light of that landscape, where are the current funding opportunities? What are your projections on funding for the rest of this year?
I'm happy to take that one. First, I'd ground this in what the market looks like today. So we're tracking a little over 1,600 active grant postings at the moment, which means opportunities either currently opened or posted as upcoming. That's about $44 billion in a snapshot today, not a full year forecast, of course. But it does tell us that funding continues to flow and hasn't fully disappeared. Congress did hold the line on health and education. So there were fears of dramatic cuts over the last, given the last budget proposal from the White House. But NIH actually landed at, according to my stats, a little over 48 billion, which was actually about a 1% increase over last year. CDC was level funded. There were significant cuts proposed to HHS, but they were largely rejected by Congress. The composition, though, of the grant market is changing significantly. So active opportunities did drop almost 40% year over year. About 15,000 and change, 15,500 grant awards were canceled, largely in areas of clean energy, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in similar areas. But the dollars that are remaining are now more competitive. There's new influxes of funding into defense, AI, infrastructure, workforce development. There's actually 150 billion plus in supplemental defense R&D, and some of that may come through the form of grants. Those organizations that are anchored in funding profiles will traditional funding profiles will feel that pressure. But if organizations are able to expand their aperture towards the priorities of the current administration, workforce, some health infrastructure, AI initiatives, and defense, there will be more opportunity than initially expected. So the map has changed. The pie has shrunk a little bit, but the money largely has not.
Thanks so much, Adam, Ryan, and Lauren, for putting the grants management business problem into perspective for me. Agencies face significant pressures to modernize their IT, but they must also maintain service continuity, regulatory compliance, and security. Some rely on legacy systems that can't require frequent, expensive vendor updates or are no longer supported. Agencies may use custom software that has little or no external support. And modernization, especially when it means moving to the cloud or SaaS applications, can strain finances and resources. One way to get around these challenges is with a third-party support for legacy systems. My colleagues sat down with Rimini Street's Robert Freeman to understand why agencies can often delay modernization efforts. Here's that conversation.
They don't delay IT modernization because they don't see the need. They delay it because there's a lot of risk and accountability associated with these systems. They're often mission critical, deeply integrated, and subject to strict security, compliance, and funding constraints. And before agencies make changes, they really have to ensure that the continuity of operations is protected. They have to protect sensitive data. They have to align with procurement and budget cycles, and they have to maintain auditability as well. So modernization tends to be really kind of a very deliberate and incremental thing rather than fast and deliberate. That's the way it needs to be, and it's very difficult sometimes in the government space to have it be that way.
So why do they struggle?
Well, there are a lot of reasons in my mind that they struggle. There are security and compliance issues. There's reliability and fault tolerance issues. There's custom code and skill shortages that they deal with. Probably the biggest problem has to do with security, statutory, and compliance issues. Many of these systems, they're mission critical and they're safety critical. And often they're associated with various statutory kinds of requirements. And they may even be subject to things like NSS. And these systems are also part of a larger threat domain. So security becomes a big problem, and the security posture becomes a big problem, and threats with respect to security continues to emerge. So vendors, of course, like to rely on these threats and the emergence of security vulnerabilities really to pressure agencies into this constant cycle of security patching and upgrades. And this, of course, eats into limited budgets and the availability for them to be able to look at options with respect to moving forward with new technologies. And it also provides challenges with respect to maintaining legacy applications, because if agencies are not able to upgrade the systems or to patch the systems, perhaps they're resource limited. That causes issues with compliance and can put the agency at risk.
So what can they do to address those challenges? At a high level, what's the solution?
Well, I think money is always the solution. Rarely do modernization efforts come with a clear mandate and a boatload of budget money for agencies. We find that, budget cycles and procurement cycles are a little bit misaligned sometimes, and agencies often work under multi-budget year cycles and compliance heavy procurement rules. So it makes it difficult for them to quickly address technical issues. And these budgets are also shrinking, and they're often inflexible. So this really forces agencies to choose between maintaining current systems or funding modernization, or not both. So it can be difficult to develop sufficient momentum for new projects that allow them to really address the constraints around things like mission continuity, funding, security, and compliance. And even when there is agreement that change is needed, agencies still have to work within rigid budget cycles, procurement processes. Staffing is another issue. Staffing has become a complex problem, and will become more complex as time goes on, as we have the average age of people growing and more people moving into retirement. We're going to find that resources are going to become harder and harder to procure, and this directly ties into the problems that these agencies have with staffing capacity.
Thanks so much, Lauren and Robert, for that deep dive into the way agencies can rethink how they modernize. Artificial intelligence offers so many exciting possibilities, from more sophisticated analytics to workflow efficiencies. And it's tempting to grab the first application you can, but there's a risk. Adding AI on top of fragmented data architecture can undermine the benefits of new technology. Disconnected systems make secure data sharing and collaboration difficult, and greasing data duplication and inconsistency. To better understand how agencies should be adding AI to their business operations, my colleague John Monroe sat down with Snowflake's Adam Edelman. Here's that conversation.
I think when people talk about data initiatives, that they're typically talking about, the dashboard or the applications, right? I saw a really cool demo and I want that thing. I think that's a trap we can all fall into. I think the real long-term decisioning that needs to be made is around the architecture underneath it, not just the tooling, not just the applications, right? How is that data stored? How are you going to scale compute? Is governance and security enforced? How are you going to share data, and how do analytics and now AI come into play? I think that matters because the stack really determines how quickly an organization can move without losing control. With fragmented data stacks, which is what you typically see on the legacy side, it's another integration project, right? If it's too tightly tied to one vendor, maybe you're going fast initially, but over time, you're going to lose flexibility, right? You're going to get locked into a single ecosystem. So I think, the underlying issue here is not just whether you have the data, it's whether the architecture lets you use that data securely, govern it consistently, and adapt as mission requirements change.
So I'm guessing, one thing that can happen is, like you said, someone sees a very cool application and says, yeah, I want that, and they get this great application, but they're running it on top of outdated technology. And I'm guessing that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. If you go solely by applications and cool demonstrations that you've seen, what you end up with is a lot of fragmentation, right? So legacy technology tends to sit on the fragmentation side of this, right? So separate systems, separate storage, separate analytics, sharing, governance, and now trying to put AI on top of all of those tools, those applications that you've purchased, that becomes a real challenge, right? So all of the duplicative data, all of the inconsistent answers, the slow handoff, and just the operational friction around doing that becomes really, really difficult, right? As legacy stacks grow, what tends to happen is you've got increasingly all these specialized teams where this is the only team that knows how to keep this application up and running, right? So the ability to provision infrastructure for this, to tune systems, maintaining the data pipelines between all of these systems becomes really, really difficult. And I would say, the final thing there is legacy applications make collaboration harder, right? And I think you can't emphasize that enough, right? In the era where we are, where we're really trying to push out as much data as much insight as possible. Especially on my side, which is focused on defense, but I think broadly throughout the government, right, value derives from being able to securely share data quickly with teams, with commands, with partner organizations, with mission partners. And if that's difficult to do, if that process is slow or risky or hard to govern, in a way that we don't understand, all of that becomes challenged.
And so I'm guessing that really gets to my next question. And that's like, it seems like this is really kind of driving that push to modernize that data stack. What do you see happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been talking about modernization efforts forever, at least as long as I can remember, right? And they're all predicated on the same thing, which is driving decision making faster, right? Back from the internet to big data to cloud, right? All of this is predicated upon making decisioning faster. So I think in some ways it hasn't changed. I think what has changed is AI, right? When I was just building dashboards, the only thing I needed to share with you was a dashboard. In the era of AI, right, agencies realize now that I can talk to all of my data and I don't need to be technical anymore. And that's good and bad, right? It's great if you have a solid data foundation, a solid governance foundation. It's not so great if you don't, right? If the input into that is inconsistent, if the governance is, brittle, if it's hard to define, then it's going to be you're going to get answers that are incorrect or potentially a violation of security policy, right? And then I think the third thing, as we get into cloud ecosystems here, right, is this growing awareness within the government around long-term control, right? I think agencies aren't really just trying to improve efficiency. I think that's always been the case. I think what folks are really looking at is how am I going to evolve over time in a way that doesn't get me boxed into a single cloud ecosystem, a single tool set, or a single now AI model?
Thanks so much, John and Adam. I really appreciate how you're laying the groundwork for how agencies need to look at their infrastructure first when going through a transformation process. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank our wonderful speakers for sharing their insights with us today. Just a quick reminder that we do have some great resources available for you to download, so be sure to check those out before you sign off. And like I said earlier, we will be sending you a link to the on-demand version of this training, so check your inboxes tomorrow. But on behalf of GovLoop, UNA, Rimini Street, and Snowflake, I hope you enjoyed today's session. And as always, we really appreciate and value the work that you do. So thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at our next training. Bye.